Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz is out with a new book called The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. Joseph Stiglitz teaches at Columbia University, is also a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Joseph Stiglitz, thank you for taking time today to join me.
Nice to be here.
The title of your book, The Road to Freedom, is this a play on Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom? Friedrich von Hayek
Yes, it is, very much so. Hayek asserted that the increased role of government at the time of World War II, where many governments were taking more active policies to maintain the economy at full employment after the Great Depression. Some countries were creating the welfare state, particularly in Scandinavia, protecting people against unemployment, retirement, healthcare, things that we take for granted now. He asserted that large role for government was putting us on the road to serfdom. In other words, countries would be losing, their citizens would be losing their freedom. And the point of my book, in some sense, is to say he got it wrong, that it's just the opposite, that the road to freedom has to be looked at from the perspective of how do we expand the opportunities, what individuals can do, and that what we've been seeing around the world is the growth of authoritarian populism. And that growth of authoritarian populism is associated with governments not doing too much, but doing too little. It's in countries where the government hasn't done enough about unemployment or stagnating wages, inequality, or any of the other major social issues that countries face. It's in those countries that we see the growth of populism.
Now, Friedrich von Hayek is considered one of the most important economists of the 20th century, sort of the counterweight to John Maynard Keynes in his time, and really one of the, this is sort of one of the leading figures when it comes to ideas around laissez-faire capitalism, isn't he?
That's right, and that's why I felt inspired to write this book. There's another figure in the middle of the 20th century that also had an enormous amount of influence, Milton Friedman. He wrote a book, Capitalism and Freedom, and the thesis of his book, similar to that of Hayek, although the reasoning was quite different, was that, quote, free markets, free enterprise, was not only necessary for economic prosperity for all, but was also necessary for political freedom. So it was again a logic that if government did too much, constrained firms, imposed policies restricting pollution, all those kinds of things, that there were that large role of government in the economy would spill over and take away our political freedom. And again, both Friedman and Hayek were 180 degrees wrong, that they actually, their policies, their ideas have really been paving the way for the growth of the populism, authoritarian populism that we've seen all around the world.
Their ideas are, forgive me for hammering in on this point, but their ideas really fundamental to the field of economics in the last 100 years or so. Has the field of economics itself failed, do you think?
Well, let me differentiate between where economic theory has gone and where a lot of the policy framework has gone. Economic theory, including my own work, actually explored the economic limits of the market. And it showed that the argument that Friedman and Hayek had made, that free markets and free enterprise led to economic efficiency and the well-being of all, was just wrong. They were trying to articulate in a way the idea that goes back to Adam Smith, who often is viewed as the founder of modern economics, that the pursuit of self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. In 2008, we saw that bankers' greed their self-interest didn't lead to the well-being of our society. We paid a huge price for that particular episode of, you might call it, liberalization, freeing the bankers to do as they will. This idea that liberalization, just freeing the market, would lead to well-being, research over the last 70 years has shown to be, just not true in a whole variety of contexts. And, if you thought about it for a moment, it's almost obvious. I gave the example of the 2008 financial crisis, but we're facing a climate crisis. And it's partly because a failure to restrain the fossil fuels, the pollution, is allowing firms to just emit enormous amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is having a devastating effect on our planet. But also think about the cigarette companies that produce these dangerous products, the opioid companies, the list goes on. And almost every sector of our economy has been touched by these fundamental malfunctionings in the market economy. So we now know that Adam Smith, invisible hand, is invisible because it's not there. That was one of the major points of my own research agenda. And that means there needs to be a role for government. The name that has been given to this policy agenda was called neoliberalism, and liberalism was about freeing. But as the great Oxford philosopher Isaiah Berlin put it, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. And so we've seen analogous things over and over again.
Adam Smith himself is even oftentimes taken out of context, right? He's not necessarily this proponent for laissez-faire, free market, free economics, capitalism.
You're absolutely right. If you read Adam Smith, he talks about the need for regulation to make sure there's competition. He said things like businessmen seldom get together without contriving against the public interest. He talked about how regulations in favor of the workers was almost always for the benefit of society, but quite otherwise when it was for the benefit of the corporations, for businesses. So in a way, Friedman and Hayek were a step back from where our understanding that Smith had presented. What Smith was saying was, yes, market forces are one of the things driving the economy to be productive, but they have to be restrained. They have to be directed, and unrestrained market forces can be very dangerous.
Was Hayek taken out of context? And I ask this because I could be mixing him up with someone else, but I think he said something to the effect of, I'm not a Hayekian. Many new forms of thought that are named after a particular person, thinker, philosopher, leader, oftentimes sort of distort and shape and mold a set of ideas differently than originally intended to be.
True to some extent, both for Hayek and Friedman. Their reasoning was more subtle, but often the caveats that they put on were just that caveat, footnotes. The thrust of their work has been well captured in the popular rendition. But let me give you an example in the case of Hayek. He was a complex thinker. His views on intellectual property rights were very different from those of the right today, of the corporations, who just want stronger and stronger intellectual property rights. The kind of argument that even during COVID-19, we should let people in the developing countries die in order to protect intellectual property rights. I think there was more subtlety than we get out of the corporate interests. Friedman himself was aware of, with externalities, you might need government intervention. The real question was how important they put the emphasis they put on externalities, and the point is now we know that they are a first order. That when we start thinking of public health, we think of climate change, the environment. We can't ignore them. And my own work in economics of information showed that informational externalities are pervasive in our economy. So,
well, what does that mean?
What that means is if you it has many implications, but let me give you an example. If you aren't able to monitor somebody smoking, and you have insurance policies against for health, then when one person smokes, he doesn't take into account the fact that his smoking is going to cause poor health, drive up the insurance premiums for everybody else. But there's an externality, and that externality is real. And that is a reason why government may need to put a tax on cigarettes or try to encourage other ways of discouraging smoking. So that's just an example where that the smoker imposes an externality, and these kinds of examples are just all over the place.
Does it mean that if one acts selfishly, and acting selfishly, if you correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of at the heart of Hayek and Friedman, and acting in one's own self-interest. But these externalities that you are talking about, does that mean that when one acts selfishly, I'm speaking broadly here, I mean, there may be exemptions to everything, but when one speaks selfishly, there is some kind of a hidden cost to society?
That's right. In a wide variety of important areas. When you choose green lettuce versus red lettuce, there may not be any externality, but there are many important spheres. There are very big externalities that we're living through in our climate crisis. That when corporations don't pay their workers a living wage, they impose costs on the rest of society when we have to provide them with the basic needs so that they can survive. In a modern interdependent society, these are everywhere. There's another important point, though, that I raise, which is an issue of coordination. Underlying Friedman and Hayek was the notion that prices can always solve coordination problems, but in fact, they can't. And I give one example to sort of exemplify this: an intersection and the role of traffic lights. If traffic lights are a simple regulation, you can't go when it's red. You might say, oh, that restrains my freedom. But the point I make is that if you didn't have traffic lights in a city like New York, you'd have gridlock. And with gridlock, no one could move. So actually, a little restraint, a little regulation like stoplights actually increases the freedom of everybody. And that basic idea that there are many instances where, say, a compulsion to pay taxes results in the government being able to do research, to finance research, that produces the COVID-19 vaccine that enables us to be here having this conversation. So yes, a tax is a restraint, but the ability to be alive is a kind of freedom that you don't have, which is more important, paying a little tax or the freedom to live. And I think most people say the freedom to live is more important than the restraint on paying the taxes so that we could develop the COVID-19 vaccine.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. His latest book is called The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. You make this comparison and compare and contrast the right to exploit and the rights of the exploited.
That's right. One of the basic points I try to bring out is that there are trade-offs. Giving one person more freedom may take away the freedom of others. Giving gun owners the right to carry guns everywhere, buy guns unrestricted, has resulted in the U.S. having more gun deaths by an order of magnitude, more homicides. So you've given the gun owners more right, but it's taken away the right to life of many other people. So the general idea that I'm trying to discuss here is that there are often trade-offs, and in some cases the trade-offs are really hard, but in some cases the trade-offs are pretty easy to decide which is right. Now, for me, the right to life is more important than the right to carry a gun. It seems to me that there's no doubt about which of these rights is more important, but there are some Americans that seem to think the other way. Another example I talk about is the right of the exploiter, the monopolist, say, to charge as high a price as he wants, even for a drug that is necessary for someone else's life, versus the right of the exploiter. And there again, I think, in my judgment, it's pretty clear how you balance that. The right of the exploited is more important than the right of the exploiter.
Have we leaned towards, though, the right of the exploiter?
Yes, I mean, one of the points, a central message, is that we've been thinking about freedom in the wrong way. And when I say that, we've been thinking about freedom more from the perspective, in this particular example, of the exploiter. You say, oh, firms should be free to do what they want, caveat emptor. Get rid of antitrust laws, competition laws, just the market will take care of everything. Well, The economic analysis shows that the market doesn't take care of many of these problems. And you might say, the freedom analysis says that we have to balance the two, and that too much emphasis has been put on giving banks more freedom, giving monopolists more freedom, giving the exploiters more generally more freedom, at a very great cost to other parts of our society. And what I want, the objective of this book was to try to call for a rebalancing of our thinking about these freedoms, and recognizing, really important, recognizing that one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. It's taking away freedom from others.
Can you talk to me about the works of Elinor Ostrom? Elinor Ostrom is the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and her work was based on what we would call the commons, resources within a community that we all have a right to.
That's right, and it was brilliant work. It was she was actually a political scientist, but with work studying the way these common problems are dealt with in countries all over the world, and what the commons illustrates the kind of externalities that I was talking about before. Let me give you an example. You have a lake with a limited number of fish. If one group fishes too much, takes too much fish out of the lake, there's less for others. And in fact, if they take out too much, everybody could be worse off, because the fish population may not be sustainable. That would be called unsustainable fishing. There are two ways of dealing with that problem. One, the way that the free market people have always advocated. They say, make the lake owned by one person, create a monopoly, and the monopoly will make sure that the optimal number of fish are fished. And so there's not overfishing, and then they will charge for the right to fish.
Because that monopoly, they say, will act in its best benefit, which would still be to have a sufficient amount of fish in the lake.
That's right. And it is true that it will solve the optimal number of fish, but it will do that at a great cost in terms of inequality. Elinor Ostrom pointed out that there's another solution just as efficient, but much more equitable. And that's just to say to each family around the lake, you have the right to take out so many fish, regulate the number of fish. It's a regulatory solution. And that system has worked in communities around the world.
And that's what she studied.
And that's what she studied. And it's an example where, some economists, many economists argued for the privatization, the monopoly solution. And of course, and that was part of what was done in the enclosure of the commons in the 16th, 17th, early 18th century in Scotland and the UK. And you can think of that as one of these examples. You took away the freedom of the ordinary cottager, the ordinary farmer in those countries to graze their sheep. And you told them, you have to leave. We got a lot of immigrants from Scotland as a result, because they were effectively thrown off their land. So you gave more freedom to the Scottish lords. And a lot of the economic literature looked at the problem from the point of view of the Scottish Lords. It was freeing the Scottish Lords. It did lead to efficiency in some cases, but it took away an awful lot of freedom for the vast majority. And Eleanor Ochram said there's another way of doing this, which is equitable and just as efficient. And that's the way of through regulation. It's not always easy to design good regulation. She points out that the regulations that they had in these communities that they studied worked pretty well. But we should also recognize that monopolies typically don't work so well for and that giving monopoly power more broadly creates a whole raft of societal problems.
That's very interesting. Talking about what happened in Scotland, this was known as the enclosure movement, wasn't it?
The enclosure movement, basically, so you have these commons, and they took the commons and they enclosed them. They made them private. It was a privatization. It was an early attempt of privatizing what was viewed as a common resource, owned jointly by people. And, quite often that kind of private ownership has not worked very well. The private ownership of natural resources in the United States in many areas has been a real disaster because some of the key natural resources like oil are reservoirs that lie beneath many different pieces of land. And so you have exactly the same problem. You have one guy trying to take the oil out from the reservoir faster than the other guy. And when they all do it, the amount of oil that you can get out can actually be reduced. And then we wind up, in the end, after we privatize, having to have a whole set of regulations. Almost all other countries treat the resources that lie below the surface as part of the country's endowment, part of the country's wealth, to be shared by the entire country. And that way you can have a public management of the resource much more efficient without the regulatory complexity that our private ownership system has brought about.
It's just really interesting how the enclosure movement really it just seems normal now, right? This is the world we live in. People own land or the resources or whatever it is, but that this is a particular thing that happens in time that, as you pointed out, took many people's quote unquote freedom away.
That's right. And gave more freedom to a few very wealthy people. Now, sometimes I say, well, basically they were stealing the land for themselves. The lords were stealing the land for themselves. And then some people say, well, they didn't actually steal it because the right was given to them by the legislature, by the parliament. But remember, in those days, ordinary citizens didn't have any representation in parliament. They didn't have voting rights. And that meant that their interests were not recognized at all. The parliaments were parliaments of the wealthy, of the lords. And that brings us, of course, back to politics in the United States, where there are active attempts to suppress voter participation, to make it more difficult for certain groups to vote, and with a clear objective that, if they're not able to vote, if our political system isn't reflecting their interests, it is the interest of the wealthy and the more powerful that will more likely prevail, or interest of the certain groups against other groups. So what we're seeing today is, I think, a very unhealthy attempt at voter suppression in order to make the rules of the game give more freedom to the exploiter, to go back to what we were talking about before, and less freedom to the exploited.
We're almost out of time, but one last question about your use of the word freedom. Does this also invoke FDR and what FDR was trying to do towards the end of his life, end of his time as president before he died, and that was the Second Bill of Rights?
That's right, and he expanded the notion of freedom beyond just the ordinary civil rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, to economic rights and notions of freedom from fear, freedom from hunger. Somebody who is at the verge of starvation doesn't really have freedom. He does what he has to in order to survive. And that's why when I say I approach the notion of freedom from the perspective of a 21st century economist, what I'm emphasizing is that freedom is what you can do, what your opportunities are. Economists say, well, your opportunity set is. And if you can expand the opportunity set, what you can choose to do, then you are more free in a basic sense. And so when we think about it from this perspective, we think about freedom as expanding your choice set, and we think of protecting you against others who would constrain your choice. So somebody who exploits you is really having the effect of limiting what you can do. So it's putting a new lens around the notion of freedom, I think a more meaningful lens than, and in a fundamental sense, a better lens than the kind of perspective that the right has been pushing for, more than 200 years.
Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize winning economist and author of the book, The Road to Freedom, Economics, and the Good Society. Joseph Stiglitz, thank you.
Thank you.